I would like to introduce Mike Tikkanen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Good morning, all. My first visit to a CASA guardian ad litem case girl, 4-year-old girl, was at a suicide ward in Fairview Hospital. I'd written about a foster boy who hung himself, 7 years old, and left a note about Prozac. But to actually be there with her as a CASA volunteer was a moving experience in my life. Her 7-year-old sister had been kicked so hard by her abuser that she'd gone into convulsions. I was with that girl for 11 years. I advocated for the removal of 7 children from that family over those 11 years. The second story I tell is of 2 girls in a northern suburb here, 4 and 7. The 7-year-old had been prostituted. 49 calls, police calls to that home over just a few years. I called the juvenile justice officer on that case and I asked, why 49 calls? And they explained that the sheer number of cases and the just terrible conditions, unless the child's life is in danger, they don't remove the children from the home. 49 calls. Now, the last case I'll tell you about is a young boy. He was 7 years old when I met him. And he'd been tied to didn't take for 4 years. He was covered from head to foot in bruises. And it was all because the state didn't think it important to investigate the birth father who asked for custody from prison. He'd spent 2/3 of his adult life in prison for the kind of crimes he was about to commit on his son, and there was a court order in an adjacent state keeping him from young boys. Yeah. He's still with me since 1996. Now, the reason I tell these stories is quite simple. 3 reasons. The first is these children have no voice. They have no voice in the homes they're raised in. They have no voice in the courts that rule their lives. They have no voice in the media. We find a baby in a dumpster, we blame the mother, we blame the social worker, and we move on. Their story is never told. 6 million cases a year. 6 million children a year are reported to child protection. It used to be 5 years ago that about 800,000 got into the system and got evaluated. That's not so anymore because budgets are tight and things have been cut back. Now, the second reason I tell these stories is the money. A lot of people don't really rise up to the emotional part of it, but the money part they will, and that's why I'm here. Art Rolnick and the Federal Reserve have done terrific work, and most of you are somewhat aware, I'm hoping, of the studies that the Federal Reserve Bank did by their work in 2003, showing the great return on investment and all the good that comes from investing in crisis nurseries and daycare and subsidized daycare, things like that. I use a different approach. I'm going to tell you the cost of the last young boy I told you about. He aged out of foster care a few years ago at least $3 million. I've been on an airplane with him to a suicide bed up in northern Minnesota, and he had that a dozen times in his life. He was a tortured boy. That $3 million doesn't include the people he stabbed, the teacher he's beat up, or the terrible property damage he's done to people over the years. And he's a young man. He's got AIDS now. He's on the most expensive drug regimen in the nation. He's always been a state ward. He'll always be a state ward. And I could tell you that story of 50 children that I worked with in child protection over a 12-year period active. I'm still a CASA guardian ad litem. I'm still on the board. And I can't believe that more people don't know and understand, aren't aware of 6 million children a year reported to child protection services in this nation a year. It explains why the prisons are full. It explains why the schools don't work. It explains why the public health system with Prozac, Ritalin, and Zoloft. And I have a judge that gave me a list of the children on psychotropic medications. It's 3 pages long, as young as 6 years of age. These are serious drugs, and I don't know, just as a sidebar, how many of you have experienced suicidal ideation because of psychotropic medications, but I have. And I had Topamax given to me by the Mayo Clinic against my wishes for migraine headaches some years ago. And in the middle of the day, having lunch with a friend, I've experienced suicidal ideation. It's absolutely terrifying, absolutely terrifying. The only other time I've been that frightened in my life was a shark attack in Cozumel. I couldn't sleep for 2 nights. The same thing with the suicide. And I study mental health, and it was still absolutely terrifying. And yet we give these drugs to these children. So the second reason is to show about the money. The money. if we were to go through these millions of dollars that have been spent and will be spent on state wards, and I think that's a confusion. We're going to talk about that more in a minute, but early intervention is the answer. Breaking the cycle of abused and neglected children having their own families of abused and neglected children is the answer, and we can do that. We can do that. We have the answers. That's the third reason I tell these stories, is because the answers are there. We know what to do. Our colleges, our universities have invented incredibly powerful ways of helping traumatized youth. We know what to do. We know how to do it. We just don't do it. Now, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but I want 3 definitions and a premise to be understood so that we're talking about the same thing. The first definition is torture. The World Health Organization defines torture as extended exposure to violence and deprivation. Every child in my caseload over 12 years suffered from extended exposure to violence and deprivation. About half of them had been sexually abused. 1 as young as 2, 3 at 4. The second definition I talk about is state ward. I believe that if people in this nation understood the consequences of what a state ward really means, it encompasses everything from recidivism to Judge Blatt's former Chief Justice Kathleen Blatt's statement that 90% of the youth in juvenile justice have come through child protection. 66% of the youth in juvenile justice suffer from mental health disorders, half of that number from multiple serious chronic disorders. Many of them are dangerous. State ward, the last boy I told you about, has always been a state ward. He will always be a state ward. He's never had a nice day in his life. We could have fixed that many, many times. And I can tell that story 50 times, 50 kids. The third definition is mental health. And for that, I'm going to draw your attention to the little card on the table. And I've stolen a definition from Dr. Reed Sulik, who I have the utmost respect for. He was the chief child psychiatrist in the state of Minnesota for about 3 years. His definition of mental health is quite simple: the ability to cope. If you can sit in a classroom and learn how to read, if you can sit and meet your peers, be comfortable with yourself, you have mental health. Now, if you look at the diagonal line in the middle on this I stole from Dr. Reed Sulik. It's a copy, not exact. But basically on the left, the vertical line going up is what it takes to have mental health. And then on the bottom, the horizontal line is how much mental health we have. And most of us were born where have the mental health where the dot is there. Because our parents knew how to read. Our parents wanted us to know how to read. We got to go to school. We got to get a high school education, a GED. So we're lucky to be born into the middle of the mental health spectrum. And then some of us got lucky and got to go to college and get a degree and get insurance and a good job. And I can get drunk, fall down, go to jail, come out and go back to work, and I'll be all right. The kids born in the lower left-hand corner are born into dysfunctional families. Drug use, violence, sex abuse, terrible, terrible things I could tell you about that are just awful. And if the community doesn't help deliver mental health to those children, it ain't gonna come. The stork doesn't bring mental health. And so the issues we face with Prozac, Ritalin, and Zoloft, with crime, we got 2.5 million people in prison today. 2.5 million people, 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population. Mental health, that's what it's all about. One of my neighbors actually put his 15-year-old child into the juvenile justice system thinking that boy would get mental health services in juvenile justice because he couldn't get it anywhere else. That isn't what happened. He got a criminal record, and he's still mentally unhealthy. Jeff Weiss shot his grandfather and 14 other people at Red Lake, and then himself, and he'd been talking about mental health for months. He'd been posting homicidal, suicidal notes about how his mother said she wished he'd never been born, things like that. There was no help. They built a $4 million mental health center the year after up there, but it was too late. So I want the definition of mental health to be well understood. It's the ability to cope, and we are successful when we work at it. We can make that happen. Now, I know this is an uncomfortable conversation, and that's why I'm giving it, because I believe all the problems that we have here today are because we don't talk about it. It's uncomfortable. It's just terrible. And so social workers, in fact, are trained to not speak about this because of retention, because it's privacy issues and stuff like that. But it doesn't serve the value for these children. They don't have a voice. They don't have a public lobby for politics, and the media doesn't treat it well. And so if it's not for us in this room to give voice to these children, it ain't going to happen. It hasn't happened yet. Now, so I've given you 3 definitions: torture, extended exposure to violence and deprivation, the state ward idea, that these children actually become state wards and they stay in the system forever and ever and ever. They go to prison. We had at the at Shakopee Valley Women's Prison, we had 25% recidivism, 27 for a while, because we had great programs and there was a great it worked. But then a governor recently decided, not this governor, but the last one, that those programs weren't important. Well, recidivism 66%. Think state ward. Think state ward. Anyway. So then the third definition is mental health, the ability to cope. It's ACE's study that's on the card out by the books back there. I've got if you're interested in the second part of mental health that I want to make a point about is avahealth.org. It's on the card on the other side of this card. Is the Academy Against Violence and Abuse. It's started by Dr. David McCullum. He was a founder who was an emergency room doctor that recognized that almost everybody coming through his emergency room doors had been an abused child. So they started what is now an international organization of doctors, medical administrators, hospital people, and they've done huge studies, huge studies. When Dr. Bruce Perry speaks, he leaves the stage with these words: 25% of Americans are going to be special needs people by the end of this generation if we have not handled the issues that I'm here to speak about today. 25% of Americans will be special needs people if we have not handled these issues. And they've done terrific work. They're on our website. I actually implore you to take a look at these 4 websites. They're all TED Talk, Art Rolnick, a lot of you know him. The CASA Minnesota organization, I'm just a great proponent for volunteer guardians ad litem. I think it's a terrific program. avahealth.org and invisiblechildren.org is us. So that's 3 definitions. On the premise that you might argue with me about, but you're going to lose, is that American institutions are now creating exactly what they were designed to stop. And those aren't just my words. Kathleen Blatz, again, has made the comment that the difference between that poor child and a felon is about 8 years. On top of her other comment that I use a lot, that 90% of the youth in juvenile justice have come out of child protection. And I like to kind of take up on her quote about the difference between that poor child and a felon is about 8 years, with the comment that the difference between that poor child and a preteen, violent preteen, drug-addicted mother without parenting skills is about 8 years. And the woman that spoke before me at the Women Prisons Warden Conference some years ago made the point, she was a PhD lady, that the number of children had by the incarcerated women in Cook County had gone from 2 to 4 in her 8-year tenure, from 2 to 4. And her projection was from 4 to 6 in the next few years. This is generational. It's been going on for 30 years or more. And we are exponentially up here at 6 million reports a year. These are big numbers. I've given you some personal stories, but these are big numbers. It's why the prisons are full. It's why the schools are in trouble. It's why we're having trouble with public health. So that's my premise. And I'm going to pick up, there's a few I don't want to miss. So that Kathleen Long was actually the founder of that comment. She's a PhD lady from California, and she wrote a book called Angels and Demons. And it was about the problems California was having with its child protection system and social workers. We wrote books at the same time. Hers was a 600-page academic tome, and mine is the little one you'll see out in back there, a couple hundred pages. But the same premise. Our institutions today are creating exactly what they were designed to stop. And it's up to us, and I'm in a political arena here, but I think this is a non-political thing. We really should all want this fixed. Now I'm going to talk about how to fix it. There are 2 approaches. The first one is the physical, where you're actually involved in things, and most of you are. Many of you are or have been. So it's easy enough, you know. We're going to volunteer at the food shelf. We're going to work at a Casa, Minnesota guardian ad litem program. We're going to be a mentor. We're going to be a big brother, big sister. Those are great, and we got to do them. Don't stop. You know, my mother used to tell me, go do something even if it's wrong. She knew I wasn't going to stab the paper boy. I was going to go out and find something to do that I kind of like to do, and I did. And it works for all of us. But that won't solve the problem. It won't. This is an intellectual exercise. This is a cultural shift. We've got just too many years of ignoring these things and not wanting to talk about it. It's gone on a long, long time. This conversation is really overdue, really overdue. There's a lot of kids involved. And it's why teachers, you know, when I wrote the book, a word about teachers, I wrote the book, I actually was with John over here at a May Day parade, and I interviewed the woman next to me, and she'd been an art teacher, and she started to weep. I interviewed a lot of teachers for the book. And she told me what it's like to be an art teacher under the No Child Left Behind Act. They just pile those kids in there because nothing happened down there. They're on Prozac and Ritalin and Zoloft. And this beautiful person who got into teaching because she loved children and loved art and wanted to be a community helper, you know, turns into managing kids that are dangerous. Not what she was good at. She quit early. And I heard that story again and again. So this conversation has to be done by us in this room. These children have no voice. They have no voice. It's us or nobody. And so I have two specific requests to help me accomplish that. And the first one is real simple. It's 5 minutes a day. I'm going to ask you for 28 days. 2 minutes, read the invisibleChildren.org blog. 2 minutes. Just there's 1,000 articles and comments. Pick one of them out covering the things that I'm kind of speeding over as we talk here because there's a lot underneath here. 2 minutes to do that. 3 minutes to talk to a friend, a neighbor, someone, anyone, a stranger, about what you read. Start a conversation. It'll be painful at first because it's an uncomfortable topic, but you'll get good at it. And this needs to be a grassroots fire like Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. I'll have you know I was a drunk driver. I was terrible, or great, however you look at it. Then one day, the Mothers Against Drunk Drivers got sick of having their children run over dead by drunken, worthless people. And in 2 years, this country went from drunken driving, where one of my cop friends told me, you want to kill somebody? Run them over, then drink the whiskey. I remember those days. There was a mother in Ireland that started a movement that stopped the sectarian violence. She was sick of it. We need to do that now. When I grew up as a child in the 50s, old people were living under bridges and eating dog food out of cans. The media got a hold of it and did something with it. My 92-year-old uncle, who never made any money in his life, died a few years ago, but he led a pretty nice life because of what happened in the 50s, with the media taking it and running with it. We have to do that. Now, I've talked to state senators and reps over the years, and recently now there's listening a little bit more, but when I started here 5-10 years ago, you know, there's just not enough foster parents, adoptive parents, people that are doing the work. You know, they're so busy, teachers, social workers. They're not good proponents. They're not, you know, we have to do this part of the work. We have to start these conversations. So that's really where I am in my talk. I'm going to go to questions here in a minute or two and ask you the second part, actually, for the moving this along. If you have other venues, political, business, or otherwise, to make this talk go further and become a TED Talk nationally, I am real interested in sharing those thoughts. So Sam's going to interpret for me because I'm pretty deaf, say a few words about Kids at Risk Action, the nonprofit.
Thanks. I call myself Sam. I just wanted to give a little pause. It's a great talk, so if you would just applaud Mike just for the time and effort that he puts into this. I'm on the board of CARA, and we get to support Mike. There's a depth of knowledge and experience around child abuse, but the one thing that you need to know is that at CARA, we stand for the child. We want 1, 2, 3, 4 children in our sphere of life to do better. And as I was talking to the special ed teacher I went to Lee School in Robbinsdale. She used to teach there. I wasn't there when she was there, but I can say this. She was helping people with special needs. And the two things that she talked about was how the kids were maybe average, below average, but their self-esteem is what they needed. And to Mike's talk regarding coping, I think that's probably one of the big takeaways that you can have, is help us to get the message out that those people in the red box, this graph, they just need to learn how to cope. And I think with our own personal involvement of just trying to take this speech that Mike gave, just a little flicker, whatever you resonated with, we all have a feeling of abuse somewhere in our lives. And you want to stand up for that child because they cannot stand up for themselves. And it's just time just to take a small step forward, if you would, okay, with Kara. If you can join us, we would love to have you a part of just opening the conversation whenever you can.